Okay, so it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Jonathon Sawyer, who I was introduced to by a friend and colleague, Frederick Clarkson. And John is a former member of a cult, a destructive authoritarian cult, in my opinion, called New Apostolic Reformation, that comprises some 30 to 40 million Americans and over 900 million people worldwide. He's a doctoral candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's written an important journal article that I shared called Unhidden from Self on LGBTQ students and the conspiratorial demonology of the New Apostolic Reformation. And, basically, he's got just an incredible personal story, but he's overcome it and is now recovering from his trauma and wants to be a scholar and help influence the intersection of law and mental health because we want to not have the federal government fund groups that are traumatizing gay people and stigmatizing them and discriminating them. And with that, I pass the baton. Jonathon Sawyer, welcome to PIPATL.
Thank you, Steve, and it's really wonderful to be here with you all. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, again, I'm here in Boulder, Colorado, and I've had the good fortune of connecting with Dr. Hassan and have been thinking quite a bit over the last few years about some of my own personal experiences with the early days of what scholars call the New Apostolic Reformation. This is a movement that emerged out of the neo-charismatic and Pentecostal movements. So charismatics and Pentecostals worldwide are around 680 million. And in the United States, there's tens of millions of charismatics and Pentecostals known for phenomenon like speaking in tongues, divine healing, faith healings, and the purported ability to exorcise demons. And I never thought that I would be here talking about my own experiences with these radical forms of demonology, but as I'll mention throughout this talk, I think it is so important for both individual students, young people especially, and adults, but also there are civic implications that I'll be discussing. For those of you who want to read the paper, please feel free to visit my website. You can download it at no cost at johnsawyer.org. But I'll start out with my experience at a Bible college many years ago. This is a group of people that I learned with, some wonderful people, and we're all smiling here, but don't let those smiles deceive you. There was a lot of trauma that was being enacted at that school through the leaders of people who claim to be prophets and apostles. And so, as I stated earlier, this work matters because we're seeing an increasing rhetoric in public discourse from politicians, from education leaders, among others that are using language of demons. And for those who may not have been raised in these type of environments, they may be tempted to think of these forms of rhetoric as merely figures of speech. But I want to emphasize that when you see the superintendent of schools in the state of Oklahoma using the word demonic to refer to a group of people, that is quite likely not a metaphor. And so there are implications for the mental health, the emotional health of individuals, and as I'll discuss a bit, also physical health. And then there are civic implications. There's been some outstanding scholarship from people like Fred Clarkson, Matthew Taylor, Andre Gagne, among others, who have discussed how this New Apostolic Reformation group was quite present at the January 6th uprising, with appeal to heaven flags, with shouting in tongues and appropriating the shofar and blowing the shofar, and doing these battle marches and those kind of things, which contributed to the ethos and the sort of spiritual climate of the January 6th uprising. So my work is about this early network of the New Apostolic Reformation. It intersects with Christian nationalism. I've heard some describe the New Apostolic Reformation as Christian nationalism on steroids. I discuss what I call conspiratorial demonology. It's this idea that demons can infest individuals, as well as states, geographic territories, cities, nations, which is where the conspiratorial aspect comes into play. I think a lot about students, particularly as there's more and more public money that is flowing into religious schools. And I'm really concerned about young people who are exposed to these type of harmful teachings and practices. And I've been thinking a lot about how we can address this in policy and law. And so I'm so excited to be here to be with others who are thinking about the intersection of mental health and the law, because that is an angle that I've been looking for. And so it's a great fit. I'm also thinking about formations of identity and thinking about these categories of identity and how that impacts individuals through these teachings of demonology. And then, of course, the physical and mental well-being of students. Now, in my paper, I do pull from mid-20th century work of Frantz Fanon, his work, Black Skin, White Masks. He is thinking about people he's working with in his own practice, African Caribbeans who are subject to colonization. And he thinks about these individuals who do not conceive of themselves as Black, because even the word Black carries such a negative connotation in their minds. And so they're unable to see a fundamental aspect of their humanity. And Fanon really delves into the psychological mechanisms of what that means for these individuals. And I think about that in the context of young people, irrespective of color of skin, who are subject to hostile rhetoric, to teachings about demons and quote unquote spiritual warfare, and are associating a fundamental aspect of their humanity with these nefarious beings. I also discuss Michel Foucault a bit, the wonderful post-structuralist thinker who traces categories of sexual identity and roots them in part in the medieval church, talks about the secrets of the confessional and desire being translated into discourse, how that led into the terms homosexual and heterosexual, which then led to some pathologizing of individuals, however, also provided the opportunity for political rights, these categories. And so all of that I'm grappling with in this article. And I'd welcome any feedback that you have through the course of this presentation, or if you have the opportunity to read the article. So moving back to the personal, this here on the right is a gentleman who was named Robert Liardon. Now, Liardon was a rising star in the early Pentecostal and charismatic movements, in particular the Word of Faith movement. And some of the key characteristics of the Word of Faith is this idea that the more money that you give to God, the more money you'll get back. But really often these Word of Faith leaders are buying jet airplanes and driving around in limousines and living good lives at the expense of many people who are devoted to their teachings. I was raised on Liardon, who you see here attempting to cast out a quote unquote demon, and learned about him at the age of 8 or 9. He built his ministry based upon a book that he wrote called I Saw Heaven, where he claimed to have been transported to heaven, claimed things like having a water fight with Jesus in the river of life, claimed to have seen a mansion in the great beyond where there are these floating body parts, where people in faith healing services could claim to be healed. But there was a part of that as a child which was quite appealing, because I was raised in this and I believed it so deeply and so fervently. But there was also quite a dark side and a nefarious side about demons and demonology. He wrote a book called Haunted Houses, Ghosts and Demons, and I have highlighted some of the text from his book where he talks about demons of homosexuality. And he talks about the fact that these demons of homosexuality could rule in physical locations. For people not raised in this may seem outlandish. I want to emphasize that for those who are raised in this, especially children, these are realities. And these have truly important implications for how individuals conceive of themselves, how they make sense of the world, and ultimately how they move into society and either contribute to the good of society or distract from the good of society. And I'll talk a bit more about that moving forward. But first, I want to discuss the New Apostolic Reformation. The NAR was started in the mid to late 90s. And the gentleman in the top left in the white hair, his name is C. Peter Wagner. And Wagner he was, by the way, a PhD at the University of Southern California, who was raised as a Congregationalist, but then embraced the neo-charismatic Pentecostal movement and began to network with primarily leaders of charismatic and Pentecostal megachurches in the 90s, and started to form these leadership networks of what he called apostles and prophets. And this group is amorphous. It's not well defined, and yet it influences millions of people throughout the United States and the world. They currently preach these ideas of 7 mountains of conquest and of domination of secular culture, which I'll talk a bit more about in just a moment. But moving back to my own adolescence, from a very young age, I was taught to believe in demons. I remember being a child believing that I saw demons, believing that I saw angels. And you could not have convinced me at the time that what I was seeing was not reality, because I was conditioned into this environment through my education, through church, through family lore, through the stories that I was hearing. And in the late 90s, I dug up this old article as I was considering what was next after high school graduation. At one time, I was a serious musician, had some musical gifts, and I had earned a scholarship to study music. But I started to be increasingly radicalized by this early New Apostolic Reformation movement and went to a church in Albuquerque, New Mexico, known as the Believers Center, where this gentleman, Lairden, who I showed you casting out quote unquote demons earlier, was preaching. It was my first time being quote unquote slain in the spirit in these practices of these churches. People who are believed to be filled with the spirit are prayed over and then often fall back into these trance-like experiences, sometimes shake on the ground and demonstrate what I would now see as a form of being hypnotized. At the time, I would not have called it that. But this gentleman, had started this school called Spirit Life Bible College. And I had received what is referenced in these circles as a quote unquote prophetic word. Now, for those unfamiliar with this, prophetic words in these circles are sort of oracle-like messages of divine guidance, or what is believed by these people to be divine guidance. And I had one of these prophets say to me that I was supposed to go to this individual school. So I gave up my scholarship that was going to fully pay for my undergraduate education and went off to Spirit Life Bible College, unaccredited, by the way. Why does this matter today? Well, it matters for individual implications for our pluralistic democracy. It matters as we think about how education can be used in inclusive and affirming ways to uphold democracy, and how it can be used to undermine democracy. It matters for true religious freedom, which is upheld by the separation of church and state. And I want to discuss the environment that I was subjected to at this school a bit more for you as mental health professionals, as those who are thinking about the intersection of mental health and the law. This is what your taxpayer dollars might be funding. The type of sermons and curriculum that we were subjected to were things like this. Does your pastor carry a knife? This Lairden gentleman, in certain church services, he preached this sermon where he'd wield the knife and walk around the audience and sometimes speak very disparagingly of gays and lesbians. And I was a student at this school being subjected to this. There was this ethos of conquest and of invasion and of quote unquote spiritual power that we were supposed to take into the world and conquer not only other people with our version of Christianity, but also society. At this school, there were also these teachings of power and health and prosperity. None of these things on their face are bad. I don't want to be sick. I like to have, be able to earn a living and be prosperous in my own ways. But this group moved things into this idea that if you didn't sacrifice all that you had, that somehow you were less righteous. They promoted the idea that the more you gave, the more money you would get back. They also promoted, going back to this idea of demons, that somehow if you were poor, that you were oppressed or even possessed by a quote unquote spirit or demonic spirit of poverty. As you can see here on the bottom right is a BMW that was driven into the sanctuary of Laridan, the pastor at this church, where everybody shouted and applauded and gave their hard-earned money to uphold his luxurious lifestyle at the expense of young people in the church and congregation and school. Now back to these mountains of conquest that I mentioned earlier. Today you're hearing these ideas that are informed largely through these new Apostolic Reformation networks, that Christians are to conquer business and government and family, religion, media, education, and entertainment. And these ideas are not limited to these charismatic and Pentecostal circles. They are also being infused into other, what the public might see as more temperate forms of Christianity. And yet we see these ideas even influencing the highest level of politics today. As many of you are probably aware, Donald Trump's spiritual advisor, Paula White, claims to be an apostle and is influenced by some of these ideas. And this matters to protect students. It matters to, as we're thinking about the public funding of schools and what students are learning and how that can be harmful for them, both personally and on a societal level. But it also matters in, I think, some of what has been a hard part of my own journey, which is coming to terms with what I was raised in and the environment that I was subjected to. I mentioned on Steve's podcast a few weeks ago, I'm now 44 years old. I didn't earn my bachelor's degree until I was 38. I didn't earn my master's degree until I was 40. And in large part because my 20s and early 30s were quite fraught. For me to even be here and be able to speak with you about my experiences has taken over a decade of therapy and personal work and coming to terms with what I experienced, not only at this school, but also in some of these environments growing up. But I wanted to shift gears a bit and talk a bit more about my personal experience at this school so that you get a sense of the reality of this, that this moves from the abstract to the personal. The first week of this school, again, I had this full ride scholarship to go study music, and much to the chagrin of some of the more rational people in my life, I went to this school in Southern California. And in fact, without going into all of the details, I had sort of been whisked away to this school. There were family members who thought that I was going to be going to the university and studying music. And instead, all of a sudden, I am flying to California and I'm calling them from a payphone in California saying, by the way, I'm not going to the university. I'm going to pursue the high call of God at this school. And some of these people I didn't talk to for the better part of 2 years while I was in this school. And these are pictures from the school that we were at. Every morning before class, we would be in these ecstatic sessions of speaking in tongues. We would what would be called warfare prayer. And so we would be speaking in tongues, glossolalia, while thinking that we were fighting devils, both within us, but also in what we believe to be the territories and in the atmosphere. And often throughout our school day, in some of the classes, we'd be learning something, usually a quite skewed version of history, for example, or other things. But then these classes would be interrupted with a teacher who would all of a sudden feel inspired to try to cast a demon out of a student, or to fight against what they believe to be territorial oppression in the classroom. But the first week of school at this Spirit Life Bible College was called Clean Out Week. Now, Clean Out Week was the stuff of legend at SLBC, and I had heard about this as I was considering going to the school, and so I was primed to believe that Clean Out Week was where the demons that we brought with us would be exorcised. And I had heard stories of people levitating off the ground. I had heard stories of women demonstrating masculine coded strength and of fighting this preacher because they had these devils inside of them. And so I'd heard all of these stories, and again, I want to say I sincerely believed this. And not to puff myself up, but I'm an intelligent person. I am somebody who, even as a child, thought deeply about things and thought critically about things, and annoyed people with how many questions I would ask. And yet I was so radicalized and indoctrinated into these ideas. And these weren't ideas that were all altruistic. And Steve and I talked about this. Religion can be wielded in ways that are very positive and good and helpful and beneficial. But we don't talk enough about how religion can be wielded to harm others, how religion can be wielded in ways that are destructive, that lead to people's own lack of self-worth, can lead, and not even to be hyperbolic, but can lead to suicide. These ideas are so important that we discuss, and it's important as a society if we want to move into a place of really freedom for all, that we're thinking about how to minimize this, how to not discount the things that we think are crazy because we haven't experienced them, but to realize that others are experiencing them. So going back to Clean Out Week, this first week of school, I'm in the front of the stage. I'm have my hands raised. I'm pleading desperately with what I believed to be divinity at the time, to be free of what I believed to be a homosexual demon. And the reason that I believed that I had had a homosexual demon is I was experiencing attraction to the same sex at that time in my life. But B, this gentleman, the Art of War guy here on the left, had written about homosexual demons and had written about being able to smell these demons, had written about his ability to smell these, what he called foul spirits. So I was primed to believe that this was really true. And so I'm there in this service. Lairden jumps up on the stage and he starts shouting in tongues. Everybody is screaming, and some people are crying and rolling on the floor. He's kicking into the air at these quote unquote malevolent spiritual forces in the room, fanning the flames of our unrestrained passions, our youthful passions and imaginations. And I really wanted to be free of this, what I believe to be demon of homosexuality. Remarkably, and by the way, when I filled out an application to this school, they asked me about homosexuality. They asked me about various things, and I was honest in what I responded, because I believed that some of these people at this school had the ability to read my mind. And so if I wasn't honest, I felt like that could backfire on me. So they already had that information, but I didn't think about that at the time. But Lairden jumps off the stage. Again, I'm pleading, and some of these figures have the ability to hone in on people that they know are sincere believers and to manipulate those folks. And Lairden smacks me in the head. I fall back, and he sits on my chest. And for a moment, I thought, wow, I've got the prophet of God on my chest. And he starts to, you know, cast out all of these various types of devils. I remember a gold chain hanging around his chest. I remembered a hairy chest, and I still can remember the body odor that I experienced at that time. And I went at that time from a moment of thinking I was in this privileged position to be experiencing the harm that I was experiencing. Uh, you all know how these things work better than I do, but sort of a disassociative state where I felt like I all of a sudden was seeing myself from the ceiling and seeing what was happening. Um, and I had just a moment of clarity of thinking, ooh, something is off here. Something is wrong here. But I played the role. I started to intone this demonic voice and started to shout profanities at who I believed to be the prophet. And I had then, he persisted while sitting on my chest, and he summoned a few of his, what he called armor bearers, who came over and then held my limbs to the ground. And then in this moment, I don't know how long it lasted, but it felt like an eternity. I started losing my breath. And so my windpipe had been obstructed. And then he, I believe, realized that this perhaps had gone too far. But we went from this moment, and by the way, there are all these students watching. And then the band starts to play. And in that moment, I couldn't hear anything. I didn't know what was happening other than I'm being subjected to what was a physical and psychological assault. But I was still a true believer, even though I had that moment of clarity. And the band started to play again. And the band, the lyrics, I remember the lyrics. When I think about Jesus and what he's done for me, when I think about Jesus and how he set me free, I'm going to dance, 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 dance all day. So everybody starts to dance within this service. And I was numb and shocked. But I did what was expected of me. I got up off the floor and I started to jolt and to dance and to show that somehow I had been free of these demonic things. And I remember walking home that day and feeling so out of sorts. And that led to a period of time over the next 2 years of some ways that my body was responding to the trauma. I mean, I was doing things like hiding in closets, like literally hiding in closets and putting clothes over me so that my roommates couldn't find me. I had internalized the shame to such a large degree while there. And these are just some more pictures of some of the folks at this school and church. Some of you might remember a guy named Benny Hinn. He was a faith healer and evangelist who was popular in the 90s. You'll see him over on the left. He also visited our school. So these are the type of folks that were, coming and profiting off of our sincere belief. And so I want to end this and move into a time of comments and questions. But I want to just circle back to why it matters. It matters because we have politicians and education leaders who are using words of demons. And these are not metaphorical for these folks. It matters for individual mental health, for social well-being, and it matters civically as well. It matters as we're thinking about the way that the framers of the Constitution set it up to have a clear delineation between church and state so that the government does not abuse their power, so that people have true religious freedom. It matters because of the money that is flowing into religious school, billions of dollars at this point. And ultimately, it matters for these people who experience some of this. Don't be deceived by their smiles. I wasn't the only one who experienced this, and that's something I want to stress. And if you would like to read more about the experience, there's my website. I do have Steve's podcast, which has been out there. I've got another one with Rachel Bernstein. It's a 2-episode series. And then I've got an op-ed coming out with Religion Dispatches in a few weeks that touches on some of this as well. So thank you so much for your time.